Seelow Heights, Germany, April 16, 1945. 9,000 Soviet guns fired at 3 in the morning, but 30 men never heard the silence that followed. I am the War Maestro, and tonight we enter the fog, where orders from dead officers still echo across the battlefield. The largest artillery bombardment in human history began at precisely 3 o'clock on the morning of April 16, 1945. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's first Belarusian front unleashed over 9,000 guns across a 40-kilometer front, their muzzle flashes turning the countryside into a vision of mechanized hell. 1 million Soviet troops waited in the pre-dawn darkness, preparing for the final push toward Berlin. What happened next would never appear in any official military record, because 30 men walked into a fog that morning, and only one came back sane. Among those doomed soldiers, Unit 739 huddled in a communications trench, their punishment details making them expendable enough for the most dangerous assignments. Private Alexei Morozov pressed his back against the muddy trench wall, his hands trembling as he folded a letter to his sister. The paper was already damp from the morning mist that seemed to cling to everything like cold fingers. Around him, 29 other men checked their rifles with the mechanical precision of soldiers who had learned that preparation was the only prayer that mattered. Most were criminals, deserters, or men who had asked the wrong questions at the wrong time. All of them understood that penal battalions existed to die first. Sergeant Viktor Dragunov studied the hastily drawn map by the light of a shielded lantern. Grid reference 17C marked their objective, a suspected enemy machine gun nest positioned on the forward slope of the heights. Intelligence suggested minimal resistance, but intelligence had been wrong before. The veteran sergeant ran his finger along the approach route, noting the marsh grass symbols that indicated soft ground. His weathered face bore the scars of Stalingrad, where he had learned that the earth itself could become your enemy. "Listen carefully," Dragunov said, his voice cutting through the distant rumble of artillery. "We advance in 3 columns through the marsh. Radio contact every 15 minutes. No heroics, no individual initiatives. We clear the position and hold until the main force arrives." He folded the map, his eyes meeting each man's gaze. "The fog is thick this morning. Stay close to your section leaders." The bombardment suddenly ceased, leaving an unnatural silence that made their ears ring. In that moment of quiet, Morozov noticed something strange. The fog that had been drifting casually across no man's land began to thicken, rolling toward them with an almost deliberate purpose. It wasn't the normal ground mist of early morning, but something denser, more substantial. The temperature dropped perceptibly, and several men instinctively pulled their greatcoats tighter. "Signal flares in 5 minutes," came the order from battalion command. "All units prepare for advance." Dragunov checked his watch, then looked at his men. They were scared, as they should be, but they were ready. Unit 739 had been forged from failures and misfits, but they had learned to function as soldiers. What none of them realized was that they were about to encounter something that no amount of military training could prepare them for. The fog continued to thicken, and Private Morozov found himself thinking of his village, where morning mist would rise from the river and dissipate with the first touch of sunlight. This fog felt different somehow, as if it were not simply weather, but something with its own intentions. He shook his head, dismissing the thought as pre-battle nerves. Above them, the first signal flares burst into the gray sky, their red light barely visible through the increasingly dense fog. The signal flares died in the fog like candles snuffed by invisible hands. Unit 739 climbed from their trench at exactly 0315. Their boots squelching in mud that felt colder than the morning air warranted. Within 10 steps, the fog had swallowed them completely. Dragunov held his compass steady, watching the needle swing uncertainly between east and northeast. The marsh grass beneath their feet grew thicker, and the ground became increasingly treacherous. Private Morozov stayed close to his section leader, counting steps as he had been trained. 50 paces forward, pause, listen, advance. But the fog seemed to muffle everything except their own breathing and the wet sounds of their movement through the marsh. No artillery echoed from the main offensive. No small arms fire crackled from the heights ahead. The silence felt unnatural, as if they had stepped outside the war entirely. "Contact in 2 minutes," Dragunov whispered into his radio handset. Static answered him. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing but white noise that seemed to carry whispers just below the threshold of understanding. The sergeant frowned, tapping the radio casing. Battalion communications had been working perfectly an hour ago. The fog pressed against them with an almost physical weight. Visibility dropped to less than 3 meters, forcing the platoon to close ranks until they were nearly touching. Private Komarov, walking point, suddenly stopped and raised his hand. The column froze. Through the white curtain ahead, dark shapes emerged. Trees, Morozov thought at first, but trees didn't grow in perfect formation in this marshy ground. As they crept closer, the shapes resolved into something that made Dragunov's blood turn cold. Soviet soldiers stood in a neat line, their rifles at present arms, facing north toward the enemy positions. Their uniforms were clean, their boots properly laced, their weapons maintained. They stood perfectly still in the fog, and they were all dead. No wounds marked their bodies. No blood stained their greatcoats. Their eyes remained open, staring ahead with the blank intensity of men awaiting orders that would never come. Each face wore the same expression of calm attention, as if they had simply stopped breathing in the middle of formation and decided to remain at their posts forever. "Mother of God," someone whispered behind Morozov. The young private felt his stomach lurch. These weren't enemy dead. The uniform markings, the equipment, even the way they stood, indicated they were Soviet forces. But no Soviet unit had advanced this far into the marsh. Unit 739 was supposed to be the first. Dragunov approached the nearest corpse, a sergeant with chevrons identical to his own. The man's skin felt normal, not cold as a dead body should be. No rigor mortis stiffened the limbs. The sergeant's eyes tracked Dragunov's movement with mechanical precision, though his body remained motionless. "Check their identification," Dragunov ordered, his voice carefully controlled. Private Sokolov searched the dead sergeant's pockets and pulled out a soggy paybook. The pages were filled with entries dated months in the future, dates that hadn't happened yet. The fog swirled around them, and for a moment Morozov thought he heard his sister's voice calling his name from somewhere deep in the white. When he turned toward the sound, the dead soldiers had shifted position. Not moved, exactly, but faced a slightly different direction. Still at attention, still waiting, still watching them with those terrible, patient eyes. The radio crackled to life just as Unit 739 left the dead soldiers behind. Static filled the airwaves, then cleared with startling clarity. A voice emerged from the white noise, speaking in crisp Russian with the authority of command. "This is Colonel Petrov of the 42nd Guards. We are surrounded at Stalingrad. Enemy forces closing from 3 sides. Request immediate artillery support on grid reference 47 Alpha. Over." Dragunov grabbed the handset, his face pale. The 42nd Guards had been destroyed at Stalingrad in 1942. He had been there. He had seen their final charge into the grain elevator, watched the building collapse under enemy fire. Colonel Petrov had died with a piece of shrapnel through his throat, choking on his own blood while trying to give orders to men who could no longer hear him. "Unknown station, identify yourself," Dragunov transmitted. "This is Unit 739, advancing on Seelow Heights. Over." The response came immediately, but it wasn't meant for them. "Baker Company, this is actual. Prepare for withdrawal to secondary positions. Enemy breakthrough confirmed at checkpoint 7. All units fall back to the river." I repeat, fall back to the river. Private Morozov recognized the voice. Lieutenant Volkov, his former company commander, killed by a sniper outside Königsberg 3 months ago. The lieutenant's distinctive accent from the Urals was unmistakable. Morozov had written the letter to Volkov's wife himself, describing how her husband had died quickly and without pain. He had lied about both details. More voices joined the phantom transmission, officers calling in coordinates for strikes on targets that no longer existed, sergeants requesting medical evacuation for men already buried, radio operators sending coded messages about operations that had failed years ago. The fog seemed to amplify the signals, turning their radio into a conduit for every Soviet voice that had ever fallen silent. "Turn it off," whispered Private Komarov, backing away from the radio as if it might bite him. "Turn the damn thing off." But Dragunov couldn't bring himself to switch off the device. Among the chaos of phantom orders, he heard something that made his blood freeze. His own voice, calm and professional, reporting to a superior he had never met. Unit 7-3-9 reporting successful completion of mission, all enemy positions neutralized, requesting permission to return to base. Over. The transmission was crystal clear, unmistakably his own speech patterns and inflection, but he had never made that report. The mission was barely begun, and they had found no enemy positions to neutralize. "Sir," Morozov said quietly, tugging at his sergeant's sleeve. "Sir, look around us." The fog had shifted again, revealing landmarks that should not have been there. A burned-out tank with Soviet markings sat in the marsh, its turret blown clean off. Steam rose from the engine compartment as if the vehicle had just been hit. Inside the open hatch, Morozov could see a tanker's helmet, and beneath it, the pale oval of a face turned upward. The man's lips moved silently, as if he were trying to speak. Beyond the tank, more impossible sights emerged from the white. A field telephone on a wooden post, its wire disappearing into the fog. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Each ring echoed strangely, as if the sound were coming from underwater. When it stopped, the silence felt heavier than before. Private Sokolov walked toward the telephone, his rifle forgotten at his side. "My brother," he said dreamily. "My brother is calling me." He reached for the handset, but Dragunov caught his wrist. "No," the sergeant said firmly. "We don't answer calls from the dead." The fog swirled around them, and suddenly they were walking past the same landmarks again. The tank with its silent occupant, the ringing telephone, the neat formation of dead soldiers standing at eternal attention. Everything exactly as they had seen it before, as if they were trapped in a loop of their own making. Morozov checked his watch. The hands had stopped at 3:15. Around him, his comrades wore expressions of growing confusion and fear. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but time itself seemed to have become negotiable in this place. The radio continued its litany of impossible transmissions, and Morozov began to understand that they were not simply lost in the fog. They had wandered into something far worse than enemy territory. They had stumbled into a place where the war never ended. Through the endless white, a concrete structure emerged like a ship sailing through clouds. The bunker squatted in the marsh, its walls stained with moisture and something darker that might have been blood. Enemy construction, by the look of it, but abandoned. No sentries walked its perimeter, no weapons bristled from its firing ports. Candlelight flickered from within, warm yellow light that seemed impossible in this cold, dead place. Dragunov motioned for silence. The tactical situation made no sense. Enemy forces would not have abandoned a defensive position during an active offensive, especially not with food still warm and lights still burning. But Unit 739 had been walking in circles for hours, and the bunker offered the first solid landmark they had encountered that wasn't a corpse or a phantom. "Komarov, Petrov, check the perimeter," Dragunov whispered. "Everyone else, cover the entrance. If anyone's home, we do this quietly." The heavy wooden door stood slightly ajar. Private Morozov could smell something from within: coffee, cigarette smoke, and the musty odor of men living underground for too long. Normal smells that somehow felt wrong in this place where nothing else was normal. He pressed himself against the cold concrete, listening for voices or movement. Nothing. They entered the bunker in formation, weapons ready, boots silent on the wooden floor. The interior defied explanation. Maps covered the walls, marked with defensive positions and artillery coordinates. Personal belongings lay scattered on crude tables. Photographs of families, half-finished letters, playing cards arranged in the middle of a game. Everything suggested the occupants had simply vanished moments before, called away by some urgent business. But it was the maps that made Morozov's skin crawl. The Soviet attack routes were marked in red ink, showing exact approach paths and timing. More disturbing were the names written in precise handwriting beside each route. Names of Soviet officers, unit designations, even individual soldiers. His own name appeared twice on the tactical overlay, once at their current position and once at a location marked with a small skull. "Sir," Private Sokolov called from deeper in the bunker. His voice sounded strange, hollow. "You need to see this." The back room contained a field desk covered with documents, orders written in enemy script, but referring to Soviet units by their correct designations. Supply manifests listing Soviet equipment with serial numbers that matched their own gear. Most unsettling was a roster bearing the header Unit 739, with 30 names listed in alphabetical order. Every man present was accounted for, along with details no enemy intelligence could have obtained. Under Morozov's name, someone had written "letters to sister" in Russian. Under Dragunov's name, "survivor of Stalingrad, fears water." Personal details that existed only in their service records and their own minds. How did they know? Sokolov whispered, pointing to his own entry. Dreams of home, talks in sleep. It was true. The man did mumble through nightmares about his village every night, but he had never told anyone what he dreamed about. The candle wax was still soft. The coffee in the tin cups remained warm to the touch. Food sat half-eaten on metal plates, as if the bunker's occupants had stepped outside for a moment and would return shortly. But the layer of dust on everything suggested the place had been abandoned for months. On the wall, carved deep into the concrete with what looked like fingernails, the same word appeared over and over: forgotten. The letters were scratched in desperate, uneven lines, as if someone had clawed at the stone until their fingers bled. Dragunov studied the tactical maps more carefully. The attack plan shown was perfect, accounting for every variable they had encountered. It predicted their approach route exactly, marked their rest stops, even indicated where they would find the dead soldiers standing in formation. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had been waiting. The fog pressed against the bunker's windows, and in its shifting patterns, Morozov thought he saw faces watching them. Familiar faces wearing unfamiliar expressions of patient hunger. The fog lifted just enough to reveal a sight that shattered what remained of their sanity. In the distance, Soviet soldiers fired on each other with desperate intensity. The crack of rifles echoed across the marsh as men in identical uniforms screamed orders in Russian, their voices thick with panic and rage. Muzzle flashes strobed through the white curtain like deadly lightning, illuminating faces twisted with confusion and terror. "Friendly fire," Dragunov muttered, but his voice carried no conviction. This wasn't the chaos of mistaken identity or poor communication. These men were deliberately hunting each other, moving with the calculated precision of predators who knew their prey intimately. Private Komarov backed away from the bunker entrance, his rifle shaking in his hands. "We're already dead," he whispered, his eyes unfocused and staring. "We died crossing the river. We died in the barrage. This is just the echo." His breathing became rapid and shallow. "The ground remembers everything that falls on it, every drop of blood, every last breath." Before anyone could stop him, Komarov began tearing at his uniform, clawing at the fabric as if it were burning his skin. "Get it off," he sobbed. "Get it off me." I can feel them crawling underneath. He stripped away his greatcoat, his tunic, his undershirt, standing bare, chested in the cold fog while scratching red welts across his chest. Dragunov grabbed the man's shoulders, trying to hold him steady. "Soldier, get control of yourself. We're alive. We're still in the mission." But Komarov's eyes held no recognition. "You can't save us, Sergeant. Look at your hands. Look at your hands and tell me we're still breathing." Dragunov looked down. His hands appeared normal at first glance, but when he concentrated, they seemed to flicker between flesh and something else. Something pale and cold that belonged in a grave, rather than on a living man. The sensation lasted only a moment, but it was enough to plant a seed of doubt that grew with terrifying speed. The distant gunfire intensified, and through the fog they could see the muzzle flashes growing closer. The friendly fire was spreading, consuming unit after unit as Soviet forces turned on each other in an orgy of self-destruction. Soon it would reach them. "We have to move," Dragunov said, forcing authority into his voice. "Back to the original route. We complete the mission." But even as he spoke, he felt something fundamental breaking inside his mind. The tactical situation had become impossible. Their radio carried voices of the dead. Their enemies knew their names and personal histories. The fog had turned them around until they couldn't distinguish between past and present, between memory and reality. "Sir," Morozov said quietly, "where exactly are we supposed to go?" It was a simple question that revealed the horrible truth. They had no idea where they were. The landmarks kept repeating. The compass spun uselessly. Time had stopped at 3:15 and refused to advance. They weren't lost in the fog. They were trapped in it, caught in some pocket of space where the normal rules no longer applied. Dragunov stared into the white distance, listening to the sounds of Soviet soldiers killing each other with methodical efficiency. Somewhere in that chaos, he could hear his own voice, giving orders to attack friendly positions. Orders he had never given but somehow remembered issuing. Without a word, he walked into the fog. His rifle hung loose in his hands, and his steps carried the resigned cadence of a man who had finally understood the nature of his situation. The fog swallowed him completely, leaving only the fading echo of his boots in the marsh. Unit 739 had lost its leader, but in truth, they had lost much more than that. They had lost the illusion that they were still part of the living world. With Dragunov gone, the remaining men of Unit 739 huddled together like children, afraid of the dark. The fog pressed closer, and the sounds of fratricidal warfare grew louder. Private Morozov found himself alone with his thoughts, clutching the unfinished letter to his sister. The paper felt real enough, but when he tried to read his own handwriting, the words seemed to shift and blur. The other soldiers began disappearing one by one, not dramatically, not with screams or struggle. They simply walked away into the white, drawn by voices only they could hear. Private Sokolov followed the sound of his dead brother calling his name. Komarov, still half naked and scratching at his skin, stumbled after the phantom ringing of that field telephone. Each man answered his own personal summons from the fog. Soon only Morozov remained, kneeling in the marsh beside the abandoned bunker. The sounds of battle had faded to whispers, then to silence. Even his own breathing seemed muffled, as if the fog were absorbing sound itself. He tried to continue writing his letter, but his hands shook too violently to form coherent words. "Dear Katya," he whispered to the empty air, "I think I understand now why the dead don't write letters." The fog began to thin, revealing the landscape around him. What he saw made no sense. The marsh stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with the wreckage of countless battles. Tanks from different wars sat side by side, their metal corroded by decades of weather. Rifle pits dug by soldiers from different armies created a maze of trenches that served no tactical purpose. And everywhere, scattered like fallen leaves, were the personal belongings of the dead. Letters never sent, photographs never seen again, medals earned by men whose names had been forgotten. The fog hadn't trapped them in space. It had trapped them in memory itself, in all the accumulated grief of this blood-soaked ground. Morozov understood then that this place collected the lost, the forgotten, the soldiers who had fallen between the cracks of official history. Men who had died without witnesses, whose sacrifice had been ignored or minimized or erased entirely. The fog was their monument, their eternal formation, their last chance to be remembered. He folded his letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket. There was no point in finishing it now. Katya would never receive it, just as she would never receive an official notification of his death. Unit 739 would simply vanish from the records, another casualty of the fog's hunger for the forgotten. Standing slowly, Morozov began walking toward the sound of his sister's voice. She was calling him home, calling him to a place where the war had never reached, and the fog could never follow. Her voice grew clearer with each step, more real than anything else in this nightmare landscape. Behind him, the bunker stood empty once again, waiting for the next lost patrol to stumble through its door. The maps on its walls had already been updated, showing new routes and new names of soldiers who had not yet been born. The fog closed around Private Alexei Morozov, and for the first time since entering this place, he felt at peace. 4 days after the fog lifted from Seelow Heights, a Soviet medical officer named Captain Volkov found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Deep in the marsh, where no unit should have advanced, a single soldier knelt in the mud. The man wore the uniform of a penal battalion, but his unit markings had been torn away. His rifle lay beside him, unfired. His eyes stared at nothing. "Soldier," Captain Volkov called, approaching carefully. "What is your name and unit?" The man looked up with the blank expression of someone who had seen too much. His lips moved silently for several moments before sound emerged. "Morozov, Private Alexei Morozov, Unit 739. Volkov checked his roster. No Unit 739 appeared in the Berlin offensive records. No such designation had ever existed in the Soviet order of battle. Yet the soldier's uniform was authentic, his equipment standard issue. The medical officer knelt beside him, noting the symptoms of severe psychological trauma. "Where are the rest of your men, Private?" Morozov's hand moved to his breast pocket, withdrawing a folded letter. The paper was damp but intact, covered with writing in a careful, childish script. Captain Volkov read the first few lines and felt his blood chill. "Dear Katya, they knew our names before we gave them. They had maps of places we had never been. They were waiting in the fog, the ones who came before us. The ground remembers everything that dies on it." The letter continued for 3 pages, describing impossible events in precise detail. Dead soldiers standing at attention. Radio transmissions from officers killed years earlier. Enemy bunkers that contained detailed intelligence about Soviet forces that hadn't been formed yet. Most disturbing were the personal details scattered throughout, intimate knowledge about soldiers who had never existed in any official record. "They weren't trying to kill us," the letter concluded. "They were trying to remember us. The fog collects the forgotten ones, the soldiers who fall between the pages of history. I think it's been waiting a long time." Private Morozov was evacuated to a psychiatric facility in Moscow, where he spent the remaining 4 years of his life in complete silence. He never spoke again after that day in the marsh, never acknowledged visitors or responded to treatment. The doctors noted that he would often stare out windows during foggy weather, as if watching for something that never came. The letter was filed with his medical records and forgotten. Unit 739 was never officially logged in the records of the Berlin offensive. No investigation was conducted into their disappearance because, according to every document that mattered, they had never existed at all. But sometimes, when fog rolls across the battlefields of Europe, soldiers report hearing voices in the mist. orders given in languages they don't recognize, calling names that appear on no roster. The voices of the forgotten, still trying to complete missions that were never officially assigned. The ground remembers everything, and some memories refuse to stay buried. If this account from the War Maestro archive left you staring into the fog, step forward and join our formation. Check your compass one more time. Make sure it's pointing true north, and subscribe to decode more forgotten military files. Ring that notification bell. You'll need to hear when our next lost battalion emerges from the mist. Share this story with fellow soldiers of the supernatural who understand that the most terrifying orders come from voices that should have fallen silent long ago. Remember, Unit 739 is still taking volunteers.